My parents gave me just $50 a month to survive in college. Now they demand $4,000 every month to put my younger brother through school. I smiled, dropped a single $50 bill on my dinner plate, and walked away. I had no idea my father was about to make the biggest mistake of his life by threatening my career. My name is Aaliyah, and I am 29 years old. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Financial, a massive firm in Washington, D.C., though my family somehow still believes I am just a low-level office worker struggling to get by. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Prince George County, Maryland, meant privilege to outsiders. Our neighborhood was filled with massive brick homes, perfectly manicured lawns, and luxury cars parked in wide driveways. But inside our sprawling 6-bedroom estate, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. My parents, Dion and Yvonne, were image-obsessed socialites, deeply embedded in their affluent megachurch and local country club scene. To them, children were not human beings with feelings and dreams. We were merely props meant to enhance their social standing. They used us as trophies to show off to their friends, or as automated teller machines when their extravagant lifestyle required extra funding. My younger brother Jamal was the undisputed golden child. He was the perfect son who could do no wrong in their eyes, despite a lifetime of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. I, on the other hand, was simply the scapegoat. I was the daughter who never quite fit into their pristine, superficial world, the one whose achievements were always minimized and whose failures were heavily magnified. The tension in our formal dining room was exceptionally thick last Sunday afternoon. It was a typical family gathering, the kind my mother orchestrated purely to hold court and remind everyone of her supreme authority. The massive mahogany dining table was set to absolute perfection. Fine bone china gleamed under the crystal chandelier. Heavy silver cutlery rested perfectly parallel to linen napkins, and expensive crystal water glasses caught the afternoon light. The rich, comforting scents of roasted lamb, candied yams, and buttery collard greens filled the air. Yet that delicious aroma could not mask the bitter reality of our toxic family dynamic. My extended family sat around the table, their conversations a low, steady hum of country club gossip, church board politics, and subtle bragging. My older sister Chloe sat quietly next to her husband Tavon. Chloe always kept her head down during these dinners, desperate to avoid our parents' critical gaze and desperate for a crumb of their approval. Tavon, a sharp-eyed forensic accountant, sat beside her with a rigid posture, silently observing the ridiculous theatrical performance my parents put on. Jamal, now 22 years old, slouched in his high-backed chair at the opposite end of the table. He was aggressively tapping away on his brand-new smartphone, completely ignoring the relatives around him. He wore a designer silk shirt that I knew for a fact cost more than my first car, a gold chain resting heavily against his chest. He chewed his food with his mouth open, a picture of absolute unearned entitlement. My father Dion sat at the head of the table like a medieval king surveying his conquered kingdom. His posture was rigid, his tailored suit jacket stretched tight across his broad shoulders, and his expression carried a permanent look of arrogant superiority. My mother Yvonne sat immediately to his right. Her perfect salon blowout remained untouched by the summer humidity, and heavy diamond jewelry sparkled at her neck and wrists, serving as her daily armor against any perceived slight to her status. We were exactly halfway through the main course when the stifling atmosphere shifted violently. Without any warning, my mother reached into her oversized designer handbag resting on the floor. She pulled out a crisp, neatly folded piece of white paper. With exaggerated slowness, she smoothed it out with her manicured fingers. The entire table grew quiet, sensing the incoming drama. She slid the paper across the polished mahogany table directly toward me. It glided past the gravy boat and stopped right next to my water glass. I looked down and saw that it was a printed invoice from an elite medical school preparation program. The total amount due, printed in bold black ink, was absolutely staggering. I looked back up at my mother, keeping my facial expression completely neutral. I had trained myself for years not to show emotion in this house, knowing any reaction would be used as ammunition against me. Yvonne cleared her throat loudly, a sharp sound that ensured every single person at the table stopped talking and looked our way. "Aaliyah, it is time you step up and do your part for this family," she announced. Her voice dripped with that fake, syrupy sweetness she always reserved for public performances and emotional manipulation. "Starting next week, you will wire $4,000 a month to cover Jamal's medical school tuition and living expenses. You have a little office job in the city now. You are single with no responsibilities. You can easily afford to support the man of the house while he builds his future." The absolute audacity of her statement hung in the heavy silence of the dining room. $4,000 a month. She delivered the demand not as a request, but as an absolute royal decree. I did not react immediately. I slowly picked up my linen napkin and wiped my mouth deliberately, taking my time to let the silence stretch until it became profoundly uncomfortable for everyone else. I looked over at Jamal. He was smirking at me from across the table, his phone forgotten for the moment. He fully expected me to bow to their demands, just like Chloe always did when they pressured her for money or favors. I shifted my gaze to my father, who was nodding slowly in agreement with my mother, his chest puffed out with patriarchal pride. I chuckled coldly. The sound was harsh and humorless, making my mother narrow her perfectly threaded eyebrows in sudden irritation. $4,000 a month, I said, my voice steady, calm, and completely devoid of the fear they expected to hear. "That is really funny, Mom." Yvonne slammed her hand on the table. "Do not use that tone with me," she warned. "I am not asking for a favor. I am telling you your familial duty." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "When I was carrying a full course load at Spelman College, trying desperately to build a future for myself, you sent me exactly one crumpled $50 bill every single month. You used to tape a yellow sticky note to it that just said, 'Figure it out.'" My mother opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand, cutting her off instantly. "I scrubbed cafeteria toilets at 2 in the morning just to survive," I continued, my voice growing harder and louder with every word. "The bleach burned my hands and the exhaustion settled deep into my bones. I ate leftover dining hall food from discarded trays so I could afford my required textbooks. I walked 2 miles in the freezing rain to get to my unpaid internship because you refused to co-sign a tiny loan for a used car. And while I was doing all of that, while I was literally starving and freezing in Atlanta, you two bought Jamal a brand new jet ski for his sweet 16. You threw him a lavish party catered by a private chef. You bought him a luxury vehicle because he managed to get a C average in his high school classes." I looked at my brother, who had finally stopped playing on his phone. He looked annoyed, rolling his eyes as if my trauma was just a boring inconvenience interrupting his meal. He did not even have the decency to look ashamed. "So no," I said, locking eyes with my mother. "I will absolutely not be funding his imaginary medical school dreams or his luxury lifestyle." The entire table gasped in unison. Aunt Patricia dropped her fork onto her plate with a loud clatter. Chloe stared at me in absolute shock, her eyes wide with terror at the confrontation unfolding before her. Tavon, my perceptive brother-in-law, simply took a slow sip from his water glass, hiding a small, knowing smile behind the crystal rim. My father, Dayon, exploded. He slammed his heavy fist onto the mahogany table with such brute force that the crystal glasses rattled dangerously and the silverware jumped. His face turned a deep, angry shade of crimson as he pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. "You will not disrespect your mother in this house!" he roared, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. "Jamal is the legacy of this family. He is going to be a brilliant surgeon. You owe us for putting a roof over your head and feeding you all those years before college. You are a selfish, ungrateful girl who thinks she is better than her own blood." I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into my chair like I used to when I was a terrified teenager. I did not even raise my voice to match his screaming. I simply pushed my chair back, the wood scraping loudly against the floor, and stood up from the table to my full height. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored designer blazer, pulled out my leather wallet, and extracted a crisp new $50 bill. I held it up for a moment, letting the green paper catch the light before I dropped it right into the center of my uneaten plate of lamb and yams. "Figure it out," I said softly, echoing the exact phrase my mother had weaponized against me for years. I turned on my heel and began to walk calmly toward the grand foyer. My father shoved his heavy wooden chair back so violently that it crashed onto the expensive hardwood floor behind him. "Walk out that door right now, Aaliyah, and I swear to God I will personally march down to your little finance company tomorrow morning," he screamed after me, his voice cracking with rage. "I will speak to your manager. I will tell them exactly what kind of thief and liar you are, and I will have your miserable wages garnished for family debt. I will ruin your reputation in this city." I paused with my hand resting lightly on the cool brass doorknob of the massive front door. I looked over my shoulder, locking eyes with the man who had tormented me and belittled my ambitions for my entire life. He honestly believed he held the power to destroy my career with a single phone call. He believed I was still the helpless, dependent girl he could control with fear and intimidation. He had absolutely no idea the magnitude of the empire I had built, while he was busy ignoring my existence. I let a slow, dark smirk spread across my face, feeling the sheer intoxicating power of the secret I held. "I would love to see you try," I whispered into the quiet tension of the hallway. I pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me, stepping out into the warm afternoon sun, leaving their toxic demands behind me forever. The heavy oak door of my parents' house clicked shut behind me, sealing away the shouting and the suffocating scent of roasted lamb and manufactured perfection. I walked down the sweeping brick driveway to my car, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I did not look back. I did not need to. The $50 bill I left on the dining table was a declaration of war, and I knew my father well enough to know he would retaliate. He operated on a toxic blend of absolute control and fragile pride. I just did not expect him to make his move so quickly. Monday morning in downtown Washington, D.C., brought the usual chaotic symphony of gridlocked traffic and rushing professionals. My company, Apex Financial, occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek, glass-walled skyscraper overlooking the Potomac River. I built this firm from the ground up, transforming it from a scrappy 2-person startup into a massive financial technology and debt acquisition powerhouse. My employees knew me as a demanding but fair leader. My competitors knew me as a ruthless negotiator. My family incredibly still thought I was pushing papers and answering phones in a tiny cubicle. They never bothered to ask for the name of my company, and I never volunteered the information. At 9 o'clock sharp, I stepped out of my private elevator on the executive floor. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I reviewed a digital portfolio on my tablet. The morning was supposed to begin with a board meeting regarding a new portfolio of corporate debt we were acquiring. Instead, a booming, aggressive voice echoed from the main reception area, shattering the professional quiet of my floor. I recognized that voice instantly. It was the same voice that used to scream at me for getting a B on a geometry test. The same voice that praised my brother Jamal for simply waking up before noon. It was Dion. I walked briskly down the corridor toward the reception desk. Through the frosted glass partitions, I could see my father standing wide and imposing, jabbing his finger at my lead receptionist, Sarah. He wore his Sunday best on a Monday, clearly attempting to look like a man of immense wealth and authority. "I am not asking you again, young lady," my father barked, his voice dripping with condescension. "I want to see Aaliyah Williams, and I want to see her manager immediately. I am her father, and I need to speak to whoever is in charge of her department. Her behavior over the weekend was entirely unacceptable, and if you people have any sense of corporate values, you will bring her supervisor out here right now." Sarah, a consummate professional, maintained her polite customer service smile, though her eyes betrayed her absolute confusion. She glanced nervously at Derek, our head of corporate security, who was already stepping forward with his hand resting near his radio. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice," Derek said firmly, positioning himself between my father and the reception desk. "You are disrupting the workflow on an executive floor. I will have to ask you to leave the premises." "You do not tell me what to do," Dion shouted, stepping aggressively into Derek's personal space. I'm a prominent businessman in Prince George County. I know people who own buildings like this. You go get Aaliyah's boss right now, or I will have your job too. I pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the reception area. The chaotic energy in the room immediately shifted. Sarah let out a visible breath of relief. Derek subtly relaxed his stance, but kept a watchful eye on my father. Several junior analysts, who had paused in the hallway to watch the commotion, immediately stood up straighter. "It is fine, Derek," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "Let him speak to the boss." My father whipped around his face, flushed with triumph. He looked me up and down, taking in my tailored designer suit, but his sheer arrogance blinded him to what was actually happening. He still saw the scapegoat. He still saw the girl who scrubbed toilets at Spelman College. "There she is," Dion sneered, taking a step toward me. "Look at you trying to play dress-up in the big city. I told you I would come down here. I told you I would speak to your management. You think you can embarrass your mother in our own home and just walk away? You are going to march into your manager's office right now, and you are going to explain why your wages need to be garnished to support your brother." I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I simply smiled. It was the kind of smile that made my rival acquiring firms sweat during negotiations. "You want to speak to my manager, Dad?" I asked quietly. "Follow me." I turned my back on him and walked down the main executive corridor. I heard his heavy, confident footsteps following closely behind me. He was muttering under his breath about disrespectful children and the wrath of God. We passed rows of glass-walled offices where senior executives gave me respectful nods. My father ignored them, too focused on his impending victory to notice the deference I commanded from people making six-figure salaries. We reached the end of the hallway. Before us stood a set of massive solid mahogany double doors. I stopped and stepped aside, gesturing gracefully toward the entrance. "Go ahead, Dad," I said. "Read the door, then you can go right inside and file your formal complaint." Dion stepped forward, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. He adjusted his suit jacket, preparing to unleash his narcissistic fury on whoever sat behind that desk. He looked at the heavy brass plaque mounted at eye level. I watched his eyes track the engraved black letters. It read, "Aaliyah Williams, Chief Executive Officer and Founder." I watched the exact moment his reality shattered. His arrogant grin completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the plaque, then looked at me, then looked back at the plaque. His eyes darted around the luxurious corner office beyond the glass panels, taking in the panoramic views of the Washington Monument, the custom leather furniture, and the sheer scale of the wealth on display. He stammered, his voice losing all its booming authority. "This is your office, you own this." "I own the company, Dad," I said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I own the building lease, I own the payroll, I am the manager, I am the boss, so please tell me exactly how you plan to have my wages garnished." The silence that stretched between us was intoxicating. For 29 years, this man had made me feel incredibly small. He had constantly elevated Jamal, praising my brother's mediocrity while ignoring my relentless hustle. He had mocked my degree, belittled my ambitions, and demanded I shrink myself to make his golden child look bigger. Now, standing in the heart of the financial empire I built with my own two hands, he looked like a terrified little man. But narcissists never stay terrified for long. When cornered, their shock quickly morphs into venomous rage. Dion realized he could no longer command me as a subservient employee. His face flushed a dark, angry purple. He stepped dangerously close to me, abandoning the loud, booming voice he used for public intimidation. Instead, he lowered his voice to a hostile, terrifying whisper. "You think this changes anything?" He hissed, his eyes wide with desperate fury. "You think having a fancy office makes you better than your family? You listen to me very carefully, Aaliyah. You will wire that $4,000 to Jamal by tomorrow morning. If you do not, I will ruin you. I will go to our church. I will go to the country club. I will tell every influential person in our community that you abandoned your aging parents." I will tell them you are a fraud, a thief, and a disgrace to the community. I will destroy your reputation so thoroughly that no one in this city will ever do business with you again. He was grasping at straws, using the only currency he truly valued: social status and public perception. He thought the threat of community gossip would break me. He thought I cared about the opinions of the fake, pretentious socialites he and my mother spent their lives trying to impress. I looked him dead in the eyes, my expression entirely unreadable. "Are you finished?" I asked. Dion opened his mouth to launch another threat, but the absolute ice in my tone stopped him. He glared at me, his chest heaving with exertion. Without another word, he turned around and stormed back down the hallway, shoving past a group of analysts who quickly scrambled out of his way. I watched him march into the elevator, his posture rigid with fury, until the silver doors slid shut, severing him from my sanctuary. I walked into my office and let the heavy mahogany doors click shut behind me. The quiet of the room enveloped me. I walked over to my desk, running my hand along the polished wood surface. My heart was racing, but it was not from fear. It was from the absolute adrenaline rush of finally holding the upper hand. They had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair and turned to my computer monitors. I needed to focus on the morning acquisition meeting, to dive into the numbers and data that made sense to me. I reached for my coffee cup, ready to dismiss my father's pathetic threats from my mind entirely. Just then, my personal cell phone buzzed violently against the desk. I glanced down at the screen. It was a text message from Tavon, my sister Chloe's husband. Tavon rarely texted me during work hours. As a forensic accountant, he was usually buried in spreadsheets and corporate audits by this time of the morning. I picked up the phone and opened the message. There was a photo attached, a slightly blurred screenshot of what looked like a highly confidential banking ledger. The numbers on the screen were massive glowing red, with negative balances and past due warnings. Below the image was a text message that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Do not give them a single dime," Tavon wrote. "Jamal is not even enrolled in medical school. You need to meet me tonight at the Jazz Lounge on 14th Street, 8 p.m. sharp. Come alone. You need to see what your parents just did in your name." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading the words over and over again. What my parents just did in my name. The threat my father had just made about ruining my reputation suddenly took on a sinister, terrifying new meaning. This was no longer just about a simple shakedown for a spoiled brother. This was about financial survival. I locked my phone screen, slipped it into my pocket, and prepared for war. The Jazz Lounge on 14th Street was dark, smelling intensely of expensive bourbon, melting candle wax, and old leather. A solitary saxophone player poured his soul into a microphone in the corner of the room, the smooth, mournful notes attempting to drown out the low chatter of the evening crowd. I navigated my way through the dimly lit room, my eyes quickly scanning the secluded booths lined up against the exposed brick wall. I spotted Tavon sitting in the very back. He was nursing a glass of scotch on the rocks, his broad shoulders slumped in a way that screamed sheer exhaustion. He looked like a man who had been carrying the weight of someone else's toxic secrets for far too long. I slid into the leather booth opposite him, setting my designer purse on the seat beside me. Tavon did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. His face was drawn tight with stress and suppressed anger. Without saying a word, he immediately pushed a thick, heavy manila folder across the sticky wooden tabletop. It stopped inches from my hands. "Chloe thinks I'm working late at the accounting firm," he said, his voice barely rising above the wailing jazz music. "If she knew I was meeting you tonight, she would have a complete emotional meltdown. She still believes your parents are saints who just want the best for the family. She absolutely refuses to see the rot that is eating this family alive from the inside out." I nodded slowly, feeling a brief, sharp pang of sympathy for my older sister. Chloe had spent her entire existence twisting herself into agonizing knots just to please my parents. She had married a brilliant, highly successful forensic accountant like Tavon, yet Dion and Yvonne still treated them like secondary citizens, simply because Tavon refused to play their pretentious, exhausting country club games. Chloe chose blind loyalty over reality, but Tavon was a numbers man. Numbers never lied. I reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the manila folder. The very first page was a comprehensive corporate balance sheet. As the chief executive officer of a financial firm, these documents spoke to me immediately. The columns of data painted a terrifying picture of absolute catastrophic ruin. Dion Logistics, Tavon said bitterly, watching my eyes rapidly scan the printed columns. The crown jewel of your father's imaginary empire, the highly successful company he brags about at every single church fundraiser and neighborhood block party. It has been functionally bankrupt for exactly 2 years and 3 months. They are operating completely in the red. There is no revenue, Aaliyah, just a massive gaping hole of debt. I turned to the next page, my mind racing, as I processed the financial devastation laid out before me. My parents had built their entire identity around being the wealthiest, most successful couple in their social circle. How are they even keeping the lights on at that massive estate? I asked, though the subsequent pages of banking records answered my question before Tavon even had to open his mouth. They are robbing Peter to pay Paul, Tavon explained, leaning aggressively over the table, his voice thick with disgust. They have quietly liquidated everything they possibly could. They drained their retirement accounts. They took out a second mortgage on the house. But all of that was not enough to maintain their ridiculous image. Your mother simply cannot risk missing the annual country club gala, and your father absolutely refuses to show up to Sunday morning service in a vehicle that is more than 2 years old. They have been burning through cash they do not possess, taking out predatory corporate loans under the guise of business expansion just to keep up appearances. Tavon reached across the table and tapped a specific spreadsheet detailing outgoing wire transfers. But the real devastating drain on their finances is Jamal, Tavon said, shaking his head in disbelief. Look at those transfer dates. Look at the amounts. Jamal is not in medical school, Aaliyah. He never even took the medical college admission test. He never submitted a single application. Your parents have been wiring him thousands of dollars every single week under the delusion that they are funding a future surgeon. I stared at the highlighted rows of bank transfers tracing the movement of the stolen funds. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement of my younger brother made my blood boil hot in my veins. Where is the money actually going? I demanded, my voice turning icy. He is using it to rent VIP sections at elite nightclubs, Tavon replied, handing me a stack of credit card receipts. He is buying limited edition designer clothes. He is funding wild weekend trips to Miami for himself and his entire entourage of freeloading friends. He is living the life of a trust fund billionaire on money your parents are stealing from high-interest commercial lenders. They have completely ruined themselves just to keep their golden child happy. I flipped through the receipts, seeing charges for $6,000 bottle service luxury car rentals and 5-star hotel suites. My parents had looked me directly in the eye and demanded I hand over $4,000 of my hard-earned money every month to fund this absolute farce. They had insulted my career, mocked my independence, and tried to bully me into financing a lie. I took a deep breath, pushing down the rage that threatened to consume me. I turned to the very last page of the thick folder. As my eyes fell upon the document, my righteous anger froze into something much colder and far more dangerous. It was a loan contract. The terms printed on the page were brutally aggressive, featuring interest rates so exorbitantly high they bordered on illegal. The principal amount listed at the top of the page was $150,000. I scanned the terms, looking for the collateral or the stated purpose of the funds. The money had been used to secure a 2-year paid-in-full lease on a luxury penthouse apartment in downtown Baltimore. Jamal's name was clearly typed out as the primary resident. But it was the bottom of the legal document that made the breath catch sharply in my throat. There, right on the primary guarantor line, was my name, Aaliyah Williams. Next to my printed name was my signature forged with absolute terrifying precision. My parents had not just taken out a foolish loan, they had committed felony identity theft. They had chained my pristine financial record to a toxic, high-risk debt purely to keep their favorite son living in a luxury penthouse. The implications of this forgery were immediately devastating. As the chief executive officer and founder of Apex Financial, my personal credit, My background checks and my corporate standing were subject to rigorous, constant federal oversight. I held multiple licenses that allowed me to operate a debt acquisition firm. A defaulted predatory loan of this massive magnitude would instantly trigger automated audits. It would flag my corporate accounts, potentially freeze my personal assets, and give regulatory boards grounds to strip me of the licensing required to run my own company. My parents had essentially strapped a ticking time bomb to the foundation of the empire I had sacrificed my youth to build. If Jamal missed a single utility payment, or if my bankrupt parents defaulted on this terrible loan, which they inevitably would, I would be held legally responsible. My company would be dragged into the humiliating, destructive fallout. They had tried to trap me in a cage of debt, fully willing to sacrifice my entire future to preserve Jamal's fake status. Tavon sat back in his leather booth watching my face carefully. He expected me to panic. He fully expected me to pull out my phone and frantically call my legal team. He thought I would rush to the nearest police station to file a fraud report, or perhaps break down in tears at the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of my own parents' betrayal. I did none of those things. I did not shed a single tear. I did not reach for my phone. Instead, I stared intently at the bold geometric logo printed at the very top of the fraudulent loan contract. The name of the predatory lending agency was printed in sharp black letters. Vanguard Credit Solutions. I traced the letters slowly with my index finger, feeling the texture of the ink on the paper. I felt a slow, dark smile begin to spread across my face. It was the exact kind of smile a predator gets right before the steel trap snaps permanently shut on its oblivious prey. The sheer, magnificent irony of the situation washed over me, replacing my anger with a profound sense of absolute control. I looked up at Taven, calmly closing the manila folder and sliding it back toward the center of the table. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow, measured sip. "They think they trapped me," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting effortlessly through the wailing of the saxophone in the background. "They think they found the perfect way to force my hand and tie me to their sinking ship." Tavin looked confused, leaning forward slightly. "Aaliyah, this is $150,000. It is a forged legal document. This could destroy your credit." I set my glass down, my smile widening into a look of pure, ruthless anticipation. "They don't realize this lending firm is a subsidiary I bought out last quarter," I told him, watching the realization slowly dawn in his eyes. "They just handed me the deed to their ruin." Completely oblivious to the absolute leverage I now held over their entire existence, my parents decided to escalate their psychological warfare. If intimidation at my corporate headquarters had failed, they would resort to their favorite weapon of mass destruction: public humiliation. Sunday morning arrived, bringing with it the highly publicized annual charity brunch at their affluent megachurch in Prince George's County. This was not a humble gathering of faithful believers. This was a high society showcase, a glittering arena where the county's elite gathered to display their wealth network with politicians and judge one another behind polite smiles. For my mother, this church was her personal Broadway stage, and she was the star of the show. I knew exactly what she would do. I anticipated her every move. She would use the charity brunch to launch a full-scale smear campaign against me, ensuring that if I did not submit to her financial demands, my name would be permanently destroyed in our community. I took my time getting ready that morning. I chose a tailored, stark white designer suit with sharp architectural lines that projected absolute authority. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, flawless style. I applied a bold red lip. I was not dressing for a church brunch. I was dressing for battle. By the time I handed my keys to the valet and walked into the grand marble vestibule of the church banquet hall, the event was already in full swing. Through the massive glass partitions, I could see hundreds of guests seated at round tables covered in heavy silk linens and towering floral centerpieces. I paused near the entrance, listening to the state-of-the-art sound system projecting a voice I knew all too well. Yvonne was standing at the podium on the main stage. She was gripping the edges of the wooden stand, her head bowed in a picture of profound manufactured sorrow. She was putting on a masterclass in narcissistic victimhood. "It breaks a mother's heart," Yvonne sobbed into the microphone, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. We pour our entire souls into our children. We sacrifice our youth, our finances, our very dreams to give them a foundation in this world. And sometimes, despite all our prayers, the world corrupts them. The love of money takes root in their hearts, poisoning everything it touches. A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the massive congregation. Women in expensive hats nodded in solemn agreement. Men in tailored suits looked on with grave concern. My mother paused delicately, dabbing the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief, making sure not to smudge her immaculate makeup. I stand before you today not just as a proud member of this congregation, but as a heartbroken mother. She continued, her voice rising in dramatic pitch. We are facing a dark season. We are dealing with an ungrateful, money-obsessed daughter. A daughter who has turned her back on her family in our hour of need. She is committing elder abuse, abandoning the very people who gave her life, all out of sheer selfish greed. She actually used the term elder abuse. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. She and my father were driving luxury cars, wearing Rolex watches, and secretly stealing my identity to lease penthouses for my brother, yet she was standing in front of 500 people claiming I was abusing them. I did not wait for her to finish her tragic monologue. I placed my hand flat against the heavy oak double doors and pushed them open. The heavy wood swung wide, hitting the doorstops with a solid, resounding thud. The sound cut through the banquet hall like a gunshot. Hundreds of heads swiveled toward the entrance simultaneously. The soft murmur of the crowd died instantly. I stepped into the grand hall. The stark white of my suit commanded every single eye in the room. I did not shrink from their stares. I did not look embarrassed or ashamed. I kept my chin high, my shoulders back, and my gaze locked directly on the woman standing at the podium. I began walking slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. The rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed loudly against the polished marble flooring, a steady, unyielding countdown approaching the stage. Yvonne froze. Her mouth hung slightly open, her hand still clutching the lace handkerchief mid-air. She had expected me to cower in my apartment. She had expected her public shaming to force me into a tearful, desperate submission. Seeing me stride down the center aisle, looking like a conquering CEO, completely short-circuited her carefully planned performance. From a table near the front row, a figure stood up abruptly. It was my older sister, Chloe. Her face was twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. She had clearly absorbed every word of our mother's toxic narrative and was ready to play her designated role as the loyal foot soldier. Chloe marched aggressively into the center aisle, stepping directly into my path to physically block me from reaching the stage. "How dare you show your face here?" Chloe hissed loudly, her voice carrying easily to the surrounding tables. Several church elders leaned in, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. "How can you be so incredibly selfish? Aaliyah mom and dad are practically begging for your help. Jamal is dedicating his life to saving others. He is studying to be a surgeon. He is carrying the future of this family on his back, and you are trying to sabotage him just because you are jealous." I stopped walking. I stood inches from my older sister, looking at her flushed, angry face. Chloe was not inherently evil like our parents. She was just weak. She was a victim of their manipulation, desperately clinging to the illusion of a perfect family, because the reality was too terrifying for her to face. But her blind loyalty was actively enabling their abuse, and I was entirely out of patience for it. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I maintained perfect, terrifying composure. I slowly reached into my designer clutch. My fingers found the folded piece of paper Tavon had given me at the jazz lounge the night before. I pulled it out, flicked my wrist to unfold it, and calmly handed it to Chloe. "A surgeon," I repeated, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling register that only she and the closest tables could hear. "Is that what they told you? Take a good look at that paper, Chloe. Read the venue name, read the date, read the total amount." Chloe snatched the paper from my hand, her eyes flashing with defiance. But as she looked down and began to read, the defiance completely vanished. I watched her pupils dart back and forth across the printed text. I watched the blood slowly drain from her face, leaving her looking pale and sick. It was a highly detailed receipt from one of the most exclusive, expensive nightclubs in Miami. The date clearly showed it was from the previous night. He spent $6,000 on VIP bottle service while you were sitting in church praying for his medical exams, I said quietly, letting the words sink into her shattering reality. He bought 3 bottles of vintage champagne. He paid for a private cabana. He tipped the waitress $500. Do you want to know what else he did yesterday? Absolutely nothing. Because Jamal is not in medical school. He never even applied. Chloe stared at the receipt, her hands beginning to tremble violently. She opened her mouth to argue, to deny it, to find some way to rationalize the numbers staring back at her, but she could not. The truth was written in black and white ink. Call the admissions office right now, Chloe. I commanded, my voice firm and unyielding. Pull out your phone. Put it on speaker so the entire front row can hear. Ask the registrar for his transcripts. Ask them what classes the future surgeon is taking this semester. Go ahead. Call them. Chloe could not move. Her blind loyalty was finally cracking, splitting wide open under the crushing weight of undeniable evidence. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal, confusion, and dawning horror. She finally realized that her entire existence within this family had been built on a foundation of massive systemic lies. Up on the stage, Yvonne realized she was losing control of the narrative. She saw Chloe falter. She saw the piece of paper trembling in my sister's hands. Panic flared in my mother's eyes. She dropped the microphone onto the podium with a loud, piercing screech of feedback that made the congregation cover their ears. She practically sprinted down the short flight of stairs from the stage, her designer heels sinking into the plush red carpet as she rushed toward us. She shoved past 2 church elders, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered, narcissistic rage. "Give me that!" Yvonne shrieked, snatching the receipt directly out of Chloe's hands. She crumpled the paper, instantly desperate to destroy the evidence of her golden child's true nature. She turned on me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild and wide. The carefully crafted mask of the grieving, devoted mother was completely gone. In its place stood the vicious, controlling tyrant I had known my entire life. She realized her public shaming tactic had backfired. She realized I was not afraid of her community standing. In a moment of blind, unchecked fury, Yvonne raised her hand high into the air and brought it down hard. She slapped me directly across the face. The sound of the impact was a sharp, violent crack that echoed across the dead silent banquet hall. Someone in the back of the room gasped loudly. The church elders sitting at the VIP tables froze in absolute shock, their mouths hanging open. Chloe stumbled backward, covering her mouth with her hands. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow. The skin on my left cheek burned with sudden, intense heat. The room felt perfectly still. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. They all waited for my reaction. They expected me to cry. They expected me to flee from the room in humiliation. I slowly turned my head back to face my mother. I did not raise a hand to soothe my stinging cheek. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at her, my eyes completely dead, my expression terrifyingly blank. All traces of the daughter she once knew were entirely gone. "We gave you life!" Yvonne screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical desperation, entirely forgetting the audience watching her every move. "You owe us everything. You will pay that $150,000 loan. Do you hear me? You will pay for Jamal's penthouse, or I swear to God I will see you behind bars for fraud. I will destroy you." She had just publicly admitted to the existence of the massive debt she tried to hide. She had just screamed her extortion demands in front of 500 witnesses. She had just handed me the absolute, undeniable victory. I took one slow step forward, invading her personal space. I leaned in so close that I could smell the expensive perfume she used to mask her rotting soul. I looked deeply into her panicked, wild eyes. "You shouldn't have touched me," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, perfectly controlled whisper that sliced through the silence of the room. "The countdown starts now." The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary slammed shut behind me, sealing my mother and her horrified audience inside. The stinging heat on my left cheek was still a vibrant, pulsating physical reality, but internally I felt nothing but absolute freezing clarity. For 29 years, I had held on to a tiny, pathetic shred of hope that my parents might one day love me. When Yvonne's hand struck my face, that final thread snapped. Any lingering sense of filial obligation, any microscopic drop of mercy, evaporated into the crisp Sunday morning air. I slid into the plush leather seat of my waiting town car. I did not instruct my driver to take me to my apartment. I gave him a single clipped command: take me to the office. The weekend traffic in Washington was light, allowing us to eat up the miles between the Maryland suburbs and my downtown corporate fortress. I stared out the tinted windows, my mind already calculating variables, analyzing timelines, and charting a trajectory of absolute financial destruction. By the time the elevator doors chimed open on the executive floor of Apex Financial, I was no longer a discarded daughter. I was a chief executive officer preparing for a hostile takeover. I bypassed my private office and walked directly into the central glass-walled boardroom. I pulled out my secure tablet and sent an emergency summons to my two most trusted lieutenants, Marcus, my lead corporate counsel, and Elena, my chief risk officer. I paid them exorbitant salaries specifically for their ability to drop everything and mobilize at a moment's notice. Within 45 minutes, both of them were seated across from me at the massive mahogany table, their laptops open and their expressions deadly serious. "We have a breach," I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the vast empty room. I slid the manila folder Tavon had given me across the polished wood. "I need you to look at the final document, the Vanguard Credit Solutions lease agreement." Marcus opened the folder and flipped directly to the back. Elena leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting across the aggressive interest rates and the primary guarantor section. "This is a standard predatory commercial lease bond," Marcus said, adjusting his glasses. "But the guarantor is listed as you. Aaliyah, did you sign this?" "No," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair. "My parents forged my signature to secure a luxury penthouse for my younger brother. They also cross-collateralized the debt using my father's failing logistics company as a secondary guarantor. They assumed they could trap me into paying it by holding my corporate licenses hostage." Marcus looked appalled, his professional demeanor slipping for a fraction of a second. "This is felony identity theft. I will draft a report for the FBI immediately. We can have the local police at their estate by tonight to secure their financial hard drives." "Absolutely not," I commanded, my tone leaving zero room for debate. "If we involve the authorities right now, we hand over control of the timeline. The police take weeks to conduct an investigation. Prosecutors take months to build a case. It would give my father ample time to hire defense attorneys, liquidate whatever small assets he has left, and hide cash in offshore accounts to protect himself." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool wood of the boardroom table. "We are not going to play by the rules of the criminal justice system. We are going to play by the rules of corporate finance. Vanguard Credit Solutions is a subsidiary of this firm. We own that debt. We own that paper. Elena, what are the acceleration clauses on a Vanguard high-risk commercial bond?" Elena's fingers flew across her keyboard as she pulled up our internal lending guidelines. A predatory smile touched the corners of her mouth. "The clauses are ironclad. In the event of a material breach which explicitly includes fraudulent misrepresentation or forged execution, the lender has the unilateral right to call the note immediately. The entire principal plus all projected interest and penalty fees becomes due the moment the breach is discovered." "Execute it," I said. "Do not give them 30 days. Do not give them a warning letter. I want the debt accelerated and called in full immediately, because the secondary guarantor is a commercial entity, Dion Logistics. I want you to bypass standard collection procedures. File an emergency uniform commercial code lien against every single asset tied to my father's name." Marcus nodded, his fingers already typing out the legal directives. "A UCC lien of this magnitude triggered by a fraudulent default will act like a financial blackout. It will automatically freeze the business accounts, the personal checking accounts, the credit lines, and any property titles associated with the guarantors. It will happen instantly." "Make it happen," I said, standing up from the table. "They wanted to play with my money. Now they get to see what happens when the bank fights back." By Monday morning, the digital guillotine had dropped. The financial mechanisms I had set in motion over the weekend were working with ruthless algorithmic precision. I was sitting at my desk watching the sunrise over the Potomac River, casually sipping a cup of dark roast coffee. My office was perfectly quiet, a sanctuary of control and power. At exactly 9:15, my private cell phone began to vibrate violently against the glass surface of my desk. The caller ID flashed Jamal's name. He called 3 times in rapid succession, hanging up and redialing instantly when I did not pick up. On the 4th attempt, I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Aaliyah, what the hell is going on?" Jamal screamed into the receiver. His voice was shrill, completely devoid of the arrogant swagger he usually carried. In the background, I could hear the loud echoing sounds of a busy building lobby. "You need to wire me money right now. I mean, right this second." "Good morning to you too, Jamal," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "How was your weekend in Miami? I hear the bottle service is excellent this time of year." "Do not play games with me," he yelled, panic edging his voice higher. "My black card just declined at a brunch spot. It was humiliating. The waitress actually laughed at me. And now the concierge at my building will not let me use the private elevator. My penthouse keycard is completely dead. They are telling me the lease has been seized by a corporate holding company and I have to vacate the premises by noon. Fix this right now. Call the bank and fix it." He was so incredibly oblivious. He still viewed me as his personal safety net, the obedient older sister whose only purpose was to clean up his messes. He truly believed he could demand thousands of dollars while simultaneously treating me like dirt. "I cannot fix it, Jamal," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sympathy. "The account is frozen because the money was stolen. Your penthouse is gone. Your credit cards are dead plastic. You have to do something," he shrieked, his entitlement shattering into raw fear. "Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to live?" I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the sprawling city I had conquered through sheer willpower and endless hustle. "I told you to figure it out, Jamal, just like I had to." I ended the call, cutting off his frantic protests. I placed the phone face down on my desk. The silence returned sweet and victorious. 30 miles away, in the manicured exclusive suburbs of Prince George County, my parents were sitting in the grand study of their sprawling estate. The room was decorated with heavy velvet curtains and antique furniture, a carefully curated illusion of generational wealth. Dion was pacing in front of the fireplace, furiously rubbing his temples, while Yvonne sat on the sofa, nervously twisting a lace handkerchief between her fingers. They were still arguing about her disastrous outburst at the church brunch, completely unaware that a far greater catastrophe was already hunting them down. Dion's cell phone rang, the sharp sound startling them both. He checked the caller ID and sighed heavily. It was his private wealth manager at the regional bank, likely calling about another overdrawn account that Dion would have to smooth over with empty promises and fake charm. He answered the phone with his booming, confident business voice. "David, my friend, to what do I owe the pleasure this early on a Monday?" Dion said, attempting to project absolute authority. Yvonne watched her husband carefully. She saw the exact second his reality disintegrated. Dion stopped pacing. His broad shoulders slumped forward. The rich, healthy color of his skin rapidly drained away, leaving his face looking gray and hollow. His jaw went slack, and his eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated terror. He tried to speak, but only a dry, choking gasp escaped his throat. The cell phone slipped from his trembling hand, bouncing off the toe of his expensive leather shoe and clattering onto the hardwood floor. "Dion?" Yvonne asked, standing up quickly, her voice trembling with sudden alarm. "Dion, what is it? What did David say? Did they find out about the loan?" Dion slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The arrogant king of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified old man staring into the abyss of his own making. "The bank didn't just freeze the penthouse, our house, the cars, the business. The new debt owner just put a lien on everything we own." I did not have to be present at the Oak Creek Country Club the following afternoon to witness the glorious, absolute devastation of my parents' social standing. Taven called me with a live play-by-play, his voice vibrating with unfiltered dark amusement. He had received the frantic, hysterical updates directly from Chloe, who was experiencing a total psychological meltdown. Narcissism is a blinding, intoxicating disease. Despite the financial blackout I had executed, Yvonne and Dion had decided to proceed with their Tuesday routine, as if reality simply did not apply to them. Denial was their favorite drug. Yvonne was hosting her highly publicized monthly charity committee luncheon. She had 20 of the most judgmental, wealthy, and ruthless socialites in Prince George County sitting at her reserved table. They were dining on imported caviar, drinking vintage champagne, and discussing upcoming galas. Yvonne was in her element, holding court, completely oblivious to the digital guillotine suspended directly above her neck. When the waiter brought the exorbitant bill, Yvonne confidently handed over her platinum credit card. The machine beeped a sharp negative tone. Declined. She laughed it off, blaming a bank error, and handed over a second premium card. Declined. The subtle, polite chatter at the table began to falter. The other women exchanged sharp, knowing glances. Desperate to save face, Yvonne excused herself, calling Dion and demanding he rush to the club with his corporate black card to resolve the embarrassing glitch. Dion arrived 20 minutes later, sweating through his designer suit, attempting to project his usual booming authority. He aggressively handed his corporate card to the club manager. The terminal flashed red. Declined. The manager, who had grown exhausted by Dion's recent history of late club dues and arrogant behavior, did not offer discretion. He loudly and clearly informed my parents that all their accounts were registering a hard freeze due to a massive executed commercial lien. The silence in the elite dining room became absolute. The Whisper network activated instantly, spreading the news of their financial ruin from table to table like wildfire. Yvonne fled to the restroom in hysterical tears, her carefully constructed high society illusion shattered into dust. Dion stormed out of the club, utterly humiliated, leaving the 20 socialites to divide the bill among themselves while gossiping about his downfall. Back at their sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate, Dion was in full, unadulterated panic mode. He tore through his home office, ripping open filing cabinets and frantically dialing his primary banking contacts. The bank executives finally gave him the terrifying truth. The entity that had acquired his fraudulent debt and executed the lethal Uniform Commercial Code lien was a corporate monolith known as Apex Financial. This is where the sheer magnitude of my father's arrogant delusion truly shined. Despite standing in my reception area just days prior, despite reading my name on the plaque, Dion's fragile ego completely rewrote reality to protect himself. He simply could not fathom that the daughter he had abused and belittled her entire life possessed the power to destroy him. He convinced himself that my firm was just a small, irrelevant subsidiary. He decided that the true mastermind behind Apex Financial, the apex predator holding a multi-million-dollar acquisition conglomerate, had to be a ruthless, seasoned corporate shark. He pictured an old boys club executive, a man he could charm, negotiate with, or manipulate using his standard businessman bravado, still entirely failing to put two and two together. Dion threw on his best bespoke suit, strapped his fake Rolex to his wrist, and drove his rapidly depreciating luxury sedan straight downtown. He was going to Apex Financial to beg the CEO for a grace period. I was waiting for him. My security team had flagged his name the moment the lien was executed. When Dion stormed into the ground floor lobby of my glass skyscraper demanding an emergency audience regarding a commercial lien, the front desk did not turn him away. They offered him a polite corporate smile and escorted him directly to the private executive elevator. I sat at the head of the massive obsidian table in the central boardroom. The room was aggressively air-conditioned, smelling of polished wood and expensive leather. I was flanked by my two most lethal weapons, Marcus, my lead corporate counsel, and Elena, my chief risk officer. They sat in perfect predatory silence, their laptops open, their expressions entirely devoid of human empathy. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Dion stepped into the boardroom, his chest puffed out, holding a leather briefcase like a shield. He opened his mouth, preparing to launch into a charismatic, desperate plea for financial mercy directed at whoever he thought was in charge. Then his eyes landed on the head of the table. Dion stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, sealing him inside the trap. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Elena. Finally, his gaze locked onto me. I was wearing a charcoal gray suit, my hands steepled on the table, watching him with the cold, detached interest of a scientist studying an insect. The rich, healthy color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking ashen and gray. The briefcase slipped slightly in his sweaty grip. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train, completely shattering his manufactured reality. You, Dion stammered, his booming voice completely evaporating into a hoarse, terrified whisper. You can't be. I did not let him finish the sentence. I reached out and placed my hand flat on a thick, heavy stack of legal documents resting on the obsidian table. With a sharp, deliberate motion, I slid the stack forward. It glided across the polished surface and stopped exactly at the edge of the table, inches from his trembling hands. I am Apex Dad. I stated, my voice dropping the temperature in the room to absolute freezing. You forged my signature to steal $150,000. You committed felony identity theft. That action gave me the legal right to accelerate your debt entirely. You owe me $1.2 million payable today, or I take absolutely everything. For 29 years, this man had stood over me like a tyrant. He had praised Jamal's mediocrity. He had mocked my intelligence. He had demanded my submission. But right now, standing in the heart of the empire I built with my own blood and sweat, the great patriarch completely broke. His knees literally buckled. The expensive fabric of his trousers hit the carpeted floor of my boardroom with a soft thud. He dropped his briefcase. He fell forward, bracing his hands against the edge of the table, looking up at me with eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as tears of absolute panic spilled over his cheeks. Aaliyah, please! Dion begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate sob. Please, I am your father. You cannot do this to us. You cannot take the house. It will kill your mother. It will destroy our family. I remained perfectly still, watching the mighty king of the neighborhood grovel at my feet. You destroyed the family the second you decided my future was acceptable collateral for Jamal's nightclub tabs. I replied, my tone entirely void of mercy. We will fix it. Dion wept, completely abandoning his golden child to save his own skin. Jamal will get a job. I will make him work. I will force him to sell the car. We will pay you back every single cent, I swear to God. Just give us time. Have mercy on us, Aaliyah, please. He was grasping at straws, offering empty promises that held absolutely zero currency in my boardroom. I looked down at him, feeling a profound sense of closure. The scared little girl who used to scrub toilets to pay for textbooks was gone forever. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a sleek silver fountain pen. I set it on top of the legal documents and used my index finger to slowly slide it across the table until it rested directly in front of his face. I will halt the foreclosure, I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic sobbing with absolute unyielding authority. But you have to sign full power of attorney over to me, now. Dion stared at the silver pen. He knew exactly what that document meant. Signing it would strip him of every ounce of financial and legal control he possessed. It would hand me the keys to his estate, the controlling shares of his bankrupt business, and the absolute authority to dismantle his life piece by piece. He would be entirely at my mercy. He looked up at me one last time, searching my eyes for any hint of the daughter he could manipulate, intimidate, or control. He found absolutely nothing but a predator ready to feast. Desperate, completely broken, and out of options, Dion reached for the pen. His hand shook so violently that the ink blotted against the thick, textured paper. Dion scrawled his name on the designated line, legally transferring every ounce of authority over Dion Logistics and his entire personal estate directly to me. Marcus smoothly slid the document away, notarized it with a heavy brass stamp, and closed the leather binder with a definitive snap. My father collapsed back into his chair, weeping silently into his hands, entirely broken by the realization that his reign of terror had ended. I did not offer him a tissue. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and looked down at the man who had tormented me for decades. I told him to go home and wait for my instructions. He shuffled out of the boardroom, a hollow, defeated shell. The power of attorney gave me absolute, undisputed access to the financial arteries of my family. I immediately returned to my private office and logged into the central banking portals. I froze all outgoing wire transfers. I seized the routing numbers. I locked down the remaining credit facilities tied to the logistics company. The very first target on my execution list was the parasite draining the lifeblood of the estate, Jamal. Tracking his movements was effortlessly simple. He was leaving a massive digital footprint of stolen money across the eastern seaboard. He was currently hosting a lavish daytime pool party at a sprawling 10,000 square foot rented mansion in Great Falls, Virginia. He had secured the property on a short-term luxury lease, using funds siphoned directly from the fraudulent Vanguard loan. When my black SUV pulled up to the ornate wrought iron gates of the estate later that afternoon, I could hear the heavy thumping bass of a commercial sound system vibrating through my tinted windows. I instructed my driver to park just outside the property line. I needed the stage to be perfectly set. I watched through the glass as Jamal held court by the edge of a massive infinity pool. He was surrounded by a dozen beautiful, vacuous hangers-on, all drinking vintage champagne that my parents had committed felony fraud to purchase. Jamal wore designer swim trunks and a heavy gold chain, loudly bragging to a group of women about his fictitious trust fund and the agonizing stress of his imaginary medical school rotations. He played the role of the exhausted, wealthy young prodigy, perfectly soaking up the admiration of people who were only there for the free liquor and the luxurious backdrop. Right on schedule, the heavy guttural roar of diesel engines drowned out the party music. The wrought iron gates swung open, and two massive industrial flatbed tow trucks backed aggressively into the circular brick driveway. The jarring mechanical noise brought the party to an immediate, confused halt. The hired DJ hastily lowered the music. The crowd gravitated toward the front of the mansion, holding their plastic cups, whispering amongst themselves as the massive trucks threw their gears into park. 4 professional repossession agents stepped out of the cabs. They wore heavy work boots and reflective vests, looking entirely out of place among the luxury sports cars parked haphazardly in the driveway. They did not hesitate or look around for permission. They marched directly toward Jamal's gleaming white Porsche 911 and his customized matte black Range Rover. Heavy steel chains clanked loudly against the pavement as the agents knelt down to hook the heavy winch cables to the undercarriages of the expensive vehicles. Jamal pushed his way frantically through the crowd of partygoers, his face flushed with sheer arrogant outrage. He spilled his champagne on the brick pavers as he marched up to the lead repossession agent. He began screaming obscenities, jabbing his finger aggressively in the man's face, completely oblivious to the terrifying reality of his situation. He demanded they unhook the cars immediately. He pulled a laminated registration card from his wallet and shoved it into the agent's chest, loudly declaring that he owned the vehicles outright and that they were making a massive illegal mistake. He threatened to call his high-powered lawyers. He threatened to have the entire towing company shut down and everyone fired. The repossession agents ignored him completely, engaging the hydraulic levers that began to slowly, loudly drag the Porsche up the steep incline of the flatbed. I opened the door of the SUV and stepped out into the humid afternoon air. I wore a tailored crimson pantsuit, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement as I walked through the parted crowd of onlookers. Jamal caught sight of me, and his arrogant sneer instantly morphed into a look of absolute indignant relief. He actually thought I was there to save him. He genuinely believed his older sister had arrived to clean up another administrative error and bail him out of trouble. He pointed at me, turning back to the repossession agents, shouting that I was a financial executive who was going to have them all thrown in a federal prison for trespassing. I stopped 10 feet away from him. I did not look at the agents. I looked directly into Jamal's panicked, furious eyes. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of legal titles, lease agreements, and financial transfer records. I held them up, ensuring the bright red seal of Apex Financial was visible to everyone standing in the driveway. I raised my voice, pitching it to carry over the heavy rumble of the diesel engines, making absolutely certain that every single one of his freeloading friends heard every single word I had to say. The cars belong to Apex Financial, I declared, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. The lease on this property is terminated effective immediately. The funds used to secure these vehicles and rent this mansion were obtained through felony bank fraud. There is no trust fund, Jamal. There is no medical school. You are completely broke, your accounts are frozen, and your free ride is officially over. The silence that fell over the crowd of partygoers was incredibly deafening. The hangers-on exchanged shocked, embarrassed glances, subtly stepping away from my brother. The grand illusion of Jamal the wealthy surgeon evaporated into thin air in a matter of seconds, leaving behind nothing but a pathetic unemployed fraud standing in a puddle of spilled champagne. I walked forward and dropped the stack of legal documents directly onto the hood of the Range Rover, just as the heavy chains pulled taut against the tires. "Grab your bags, Jamal," I said, looking him up and down with sheer unfiltered disgust. "You are walking home." The public humiliation was simply too much for his fragile, artificially inflated ego to process. The realization that his friends were staring at him with a mixture of pity and absolute contempt completely shattered his mind. His face twisted into a mask of pure, violent rage. He lost all sense of self-preservation. He let out a furious, animalistic scream and lunged physically toward me, his hands balled into tight fists, fully intending to strike me right there in the middle of the driveway. He never made it past the front bumper of the Range Rover. The rear door of my SUV swung open with explosive force. Tavon stepped out into the driveway, moving with terrifying practiced speed. He intercepted Jamal mid-lunge, grabbing him violently by the collar of his expensive designer shirt and slamming him backward. Jamal hit the heavy steel grille of the tow truck with a sickening heavy thud. Tavon pinned him there effortlessly, his massive forearm pressed hard against Jamal's chest, entirely neutralizing the physical threat in a fraction of a second. Jamal gasped for air, struggling weakly against Tavon's overwhelming grip, his eyes wide with shock and sudden sharp pain. Tavon leaned in close, his expression radiating absolute unyielding contempt. He did not raise his voice to shout, but the deadly measured calm in his tone was infinitely more terrifying than any volume could ever be. "Time to grow up, little boy," Tavon growled, staring directly into Jamal's panicked wide eyes. "Your sister Chloe finally saw the bank statements. We are done protecting you." Tavon released his grip, letting Jamal slide down the polished metal grille of the heavy tow truck. Jamal hit the sun-baked pavement hard, scraping his knees through his expensive designer swim trunks. The bravado that had fueled his entire parasitic existence was entirely gone. He sat on the hot asphalt, gasping for air, looking around at the massive crowd of partygoers. Nobody stepped forward to help him. Nobody offered him a ride. The women who had been hanging on his every word just moments ago were already wandering back toward the pool, whispering and laughing behind their hands. His fake royalty was completely stripped away, leaving nothing but an unemployed fraud sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne. I turned my back on him, signaling to my driver. As my black SUV pulled out of the brick driveway, trailing the two massive flatbed tow trucks carrying his stolen lifestyle, I watched through the rearview mirror as Jamal pulled out his phone. I knew exactly who he was calling. He was dialing the only person left on Earth who would validate his delusion. He was calling Mommy. It took Jamal 3 hours and a heavily surged rideshare to reach my parents' estate in Prince George's County. He burst through the heavy front doors, sobbing uncontrollably, completely reverting to the emotional state of a toddler. He threw himself onto the plush living room sofa, burying his face in his hands, wailing about the repossession agents, the public humiliation, and the absolute destruction of his social standing. Yvonne stood over her weeping son, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. Dion had already returned from my office, a shattered shell of a man locking himself in the master bedroom with a bottle of scotch after signing his entire life away to me. But seeing Jamal broken, seeing her golden child weeping on her expensive furniture, triggered a terrifying seismic shift in my mother's psychology. Her denial instantly evaporated, replaced by a dark, toxic, narcissistic rage. She finally understood the reality of the situation. I held every single card. I had seized the bank accounts. I owned the debt. I held the absolute power of attorney. I had dismantled her favorite child's life with a few strokes of a pen. A normal parent would have recognized their catastrophic failures and begged for forgiveness. Yvonne was not a normal parent. In her twisted mind, she was the ultimate victim of a vicious, ungrateful daughter. She refused to surrender. She marched into Dion's home office, yanked open the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, and pulled out a thick manila envelope they had prepared weeks ago, just in case their extortion scheme required heavier legal backing. She shoved the envelope into her hardware-studded designer handbag, grabbed her car keys, and stormed out of the house. My home was located in an ultra-exclusive, heavily monitored gated community in McLean, Virginia. It was a pristine fortress designed specifically to keep erratic people like my mother far away. The perimeter was lined with high stone walls, and access required clearing a 24-hour armed security checkpoint. Yvonne knew she was not on my approved visitor list. She knew the guards would turn her away the second she stated her name. She did not care. She parked her luxury SUV down the street from the main entrance, watching the traffic flow with manic, hyper-focused intensity. When a massive commercial delivery truck pulled up to the guardhouse and was cleared for entry, Yvonne slammed her foot on the accelerator. She aggressively tailgated the heavy truck, riding mere inches from its rear bumper, slipping through the heavy iron gates a fraction of a second before they could swing shut and lock her out. The security guards shouted and rushed out of the booth, their radios blaring, but she ignored them completely. She hit the gas, speeding dangerously down the pristine tree-lined streets of my neighborhood. She drove erratically, taking sharp turns, cutting over manicured medians, and ignoring stop signs until she reached my property. My house was a stark, modern architectural masterpiece of glass, steel, and concrete, entirely surrounded by flawless landscaping and high-definition security cameras. Yvonne slammed her SUV into park right in the middle of my driveway, the heavy tires tearing up a massive patch of my immaculate front lawn. She threw her car door open and marched toward my front steps. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed red with uncontrolled fury. Her eyes darted around the property, catching the small, blinking red lights of the security cameras mounted under the sleek eaves of my porch. The sight of the surveillance equipment pushed her completely over the edge. She realized I was watching her. She realized I was documenting her insanity. Yvonne let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed across the quiet neighborhood. She grabbed her heavy designer handbag by the leather straps and swung it like a medieval weapon. The solid brass hardware of the purse smashed directly into the nearest security camera, shattering the glass lens and ripping the internal wiring straight from the stucco wall. She swung again, striking the sleek digital doorbell, cracking the casing, and leaving a deep, violent dent in the metal. Pieces of plastic and glass rained down onto the porch. She was panting, screaming my name, completely losing her grip on reality. I did not cower inside my foyer. I did not frantically dial the police. I calmly unlocked my heavy oak front door and stepped out onto the porch. I stood at the top of the stairs looking down at her. I wore a simple silk blouse and tailored trousers, holding a steaming mug of tea, completely unbothered by her violent display. Seeing my perfect, unshakable composure only fueled her psychotic breakdown. She stopped swinging her ruined handbag and pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at my face. "You were always jealous of him," Yvonne screamed, her voice carrying off the glass walls of my home, broadcasting her toxic bigotry to the entire street. "You were always jealous of his light skin and his potential. He is beautiful, he is special. And you are just a bitter, ugly girl who has to steal from her own family to feel powerful. You could never stand that he was the favorite. You could never stand that he deserved better than you." Her words were meant to destroy me. They were the exact same vicious, colorist insults she had whispered in my ear when I was a child. The constant vile reminders that I was too dark, too plain, too insignificant to ever warrant her love. But standing there at 29 years old, a self-made corporate titan surveying a woman throwing a violent temper tantrum on my lawn, her words held absolutely zero power. They were just the pathetic racist ramblings of a failed mother. I did not yell back. I casually tapped a small button on the side of my smartwatch. The digital face chimed softly, instantly activating a high-definition audio application that recorded every single syllable of her unhinged, abusive tirade to my secure cloud server. She was actively handing me the psychological and legal ammunition I needed to bury her forever. Yvonne realized her childhood insults were not breaking my composure. She realized she needed a much bigger weapon to tear me down. She ripped open her damaged handbag and pulled out the crumpled manila envelope she had taken from Dion's desk. She marched up the first 2 steps of my porch and aggressively shoved a thick, heavily stamped legal document toward my face. "You think you won?" Yvonne hissed, her chest heaving, a terrifying, desperate smile stretching across her face. "You think you can steal our business and ruin your brother? Read it, Aaliyah. Read the signatures. Read the dates." I did not take the paper from her shaking hand. I simply glanced down at the bold print. It was a corporate partnership contract heavily backdated by 5 years, completely fabricated, and allegedly signed by both of my parents and myself. "This is a legally binding agreement!" Yvonne screamed, her eyes wide and wild with delusional victory. "It proves that Apex Financial was seeded by family funds. It proves that Dion Logistics provided the initial $200,000 capital investment that launched your entire empire. You did not build anything on your own. We own you. I am taking this straight to a federal judge. I am going to sue you for total, absolute ownership of Apex Financial. I will take your company, I will take this house, and I will leave you on the street where you belong." It was the ultimate act of narcissistic delusion. She had cornered herself, and her final move was a desperate, spectacularly illegal forgery designed to steal my entire corporate entity. She stood there, breathing hard, waiting for me to panic. She waited for the little girl she used to torment to drop to her knees and beg for a compromise. She truly believed this fake piece of paper would force me to hand over the keys to my kingdom. I took a slow, calm sip of my tea. I looked at the blatantly forged document, then looked directly into my mother's wild, hateful eyes. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. "See you in court, Mother." The heavy, polished oak doors of the federal courthouse in Alexandria swung open, ushering in the final act of my parents' spectacular self-destruction. It had taken exactly 2 weeks for Yvonne and Dion to find an attorney desperate and unethical enough to take their case. They had filed an emergency petition for a temporary injunction aiming to freeze all actions taken by Apex Financial Reverse, the repossession of Jamal's luxury vehicles, and instantly strip me of my executive authority. They genuinely believed that flashing a fabricated, backdated piece of paper would force the American legal system to hand them my entire empire. I sat at the defense table next to Marcus, dressed in a sharply tailored midnight blue suit. My posture was perfectly rigid, my expression utterly serene. Across the aisle, Yvonne and Dion sat at the plaintiff's table. They were flanked by a man named Vance Harrington, a low-level civil litigator whose cheap cologne and shiny gray suit projected an aura of desperate ambition. My parents looked incredibly smug. Yvonne wore a conservative pale pink dress designed to make her look fragile and maternal. Dion sat with his chest puffed out, radiating the false confidence of a man who believed his own lies. They whispered to each other, shooting me venomous, triumphant glares. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought the court would look at their forged partnership agreement and instantly strip me of my wealth. Judge Harrison, a notoriously strict federal magistrate with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, called the hearing to order. Vance Harrington immediately launched into his opening statement. He paced in front of the judge's bench, weaving a tragic, heavily fictionalized narrative of a loving, supportive family betrayed by a sociopathic, money-hungry daughter. He claimed that Apex Financial was not the product of my relentless hard work and strategic brilliance, but rather the result of a generous, completely undocumented family seed fund. He waved the forged contract in the air, demanding that the court recognize Yvonne and Dion as the rightful majority shareholders of my corporate holding company. To solidify their absurd narrative, Vance called my mother to the witness stand. Yvonne glided to the wooden witness box, placing her hand on the Bible and swearing to tell the whole truth. She settled into the leather chair and immediately initiated a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue, her voice quivering with perfectly manufactured heartbreak. "We sacrificed everything for Aaliyah," Yvonne testified, looking directly at the judge with wide, sorrowful eyes. "When she came to us 5 years ago begging for capital to start her lending firm, we did not hesitate. We remortgaged our family home. We drained our personal savings. We gave her a cashier's check for $100,000. In exchange, she drafted a partnership agreement granting us a 60% equity stake in Apex Financial. But the moment she tasted real money, she turned her back on us. She hid the profits. She locked us out of the corporate accounts. And now, out of pure bitter spite, she is using our own money to illegally repossess her younger brother's cars and steal our family home." The sheer audacity of her perjury was breathtaking. She sat in a federal courtroom under oath and spun a fairy tale of maternal sacrifice that completely contradicted 29 years of emotional abuse and financial neglect. Vance then called Dion to the stand to corroborate the fiction. My father took the oath with a firm, booming voice. He looked the judge squarely in the eye, projecting the image of an honorable, betrayed patriarch. Vance walked him through the timeline of the alleged investment, leading him directly into the trap we had been waiting for. "Mr. Williams," Vance asked, holding up the forged document, "can you confirm the exact circumstances under which this equity contract was executed?" "Absolutely," Dion replied, his tone dripping with arrogant certainty. "Aaliyah brought the physical contract to my home office in Atlanta. It was a Tuesday afternoon, November 14th, exactly 5 years ago. We sat across from each other at my desk. I watched her read every single page. I watched her pick up my gold fountain pen, and I watched her sign her name on the dotted line. My wife and I then signed as the majority partners. It was a binding, fully executed family agreement. He committed to the lie flawlessly. He provided specific details cementing the date, the location, and the physical act of the forgery as absolute facts under penalty of perjury. He looked over at me, a sickening smirk playing on his lips, completely convinced that he had just secured ownership of a multi-million-dollar financial institution. Marcus slowly stood up from his chair. He did not look angry. He did not look intimidated. He looked like a surgeon preparing to make a highly precise, fatal incision. He buttoned his suit jacket, picked up a thin manila folder from our table, and calmly walked toward the witness box. "Mr. Williams," Marcus began, his voice smooth and unnervingly polite, "you are absolutely certain about these details. You are testifying under oath that my client sat in your home office in Atlanta, Georgia, on the afternoon of November 14th and physically signed that specific document." "I am completely certain," Dion sneered, leaning back in the witness chair. "I have an excellent memory. She was sitting right in front of me." "Fascinating," Marcus said. He turned his back on my father and walked directly toward Judge Harrison's elevated bench. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice for dramatic effect. He simply opened the manila folder and began placing items onto the polished wood of the judge's desk. "Your Honor," Marcus stated, his tone carrying the cold, heavy weight of absolute, undeniable proof. "The plaintiffs have submitted a contract allegedly signed by my client in Atlanta, Georgia, on the afternoon of November 14th. I am submitting to the court Defense Exhibit A." Marcus placed a small, dark blue booklet onto the bench. "This is my client's official United States passport." Marcus continued, handing a duplicate copy of the pages to a suddenly very pale Vance Harrington. "I am also submitting Defense Exhibit B, certified international flight manifests from Delta Airlines, and Defense Exhibit C, time-stamped authenticated hotel receipts from the Mandarin Oriental." The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Dion froze in the witness chair, his confident posture suddenly turning incredibly rigid. Yvonne sat up straight at the plaintiff's table, her hands gripping the edges of her chair, a look of dawning horror creeping across her face. Marcus turned back to face my father, pinning him to the chair with a lethal, unblinking stare. The evidence submitted to this court proves beyond a shadow of a legal doubt that on November 14th, my client was not in Atlanta, Georgia, Marcus declared, his voice slicing through the dead air of the courtroom. She was exactly 6,800 miles away. She was in Tokyo, Japan, attending a week-long corporate real estate summit. Here are the immigration stamps provided by Japanese customs. Here are the flight manifests proving she departed the United States on November 10th and did not return until November 18th. The color drained entirely from Dion's face, leaving him looking like a reanimated corpse. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The absolute certainty of his perjury was hanging in the air, a visible, tangible weapon that had just been turned directly against him. It is physically, scientifically, and logically impossible for my client to have signed that document in your office, Mr. Williams, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. Because you forged it. You fabricated a corporate contract, forged my client's signature, and submitted it to a federal judge in a deliberate, premeditated attempt to steal a financial institution. Vance Harrington physically recoiled from the plaintiff's table. He dropped his copy of the forged contract as if it had suddenly caught fire. He realized in a fraction of a second that his clients had not only lied to him, but had used him to commit a massive federal crime. He took 2 steps away from Yvonne, his face slick with panic, desperately trying to distance himself from the radioactive fallout. Your Honor, I had absolutely no knowledge of this, Vance stammered, raising his hands in the air, fully prepared to throw my parents under the bus to save his own law license. The plaintiffs assured me the documents were authenticated. Up on the bench, Judge Harrison picked up my passport. He flipped to the stamped pages, comparing them to the flight manifests and the dates on the forged contract. The air in the courtroom grew terrifyingly cold. The judge slowly lowered the documents. The look on his face was no longer impartial or judicial. It was a look of pure, unadulterated, absolute disgust. He glared down at my parents. Yvonne was shaking violently, her perfect facade entirely shattered, desperately looking for an exit that did not exist. Dayon sat completely paralyzed in the witness box, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the realization that he had just locked himself in a cage of his own design. Judge Harrison did not ask for further testimony. He did not ask for closing arguments. He did not just dismiss the injunction. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a violent, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Injunction denied! Judge Harrison barked, his voice echoing with absolute, furious authority. He pointed a rigid finger directly at my father in the witness box, then at my mother sitting at the table. He turned his attention to the armed court officers standing by the heavy oak doors. Detain the plaintiffs. I am referring Mr. and Mrs. Williams to the district attorney for perjury and fraud. Tevin released his grip, stepping back with military precision. Jamal slid down the massive steel grille of the repossession truck, his knees hitting the sun-baked asphalt with a dull thud. The sheer force of Tavon's intervention had completely physically and psychologically neutralized him. Jamal sat in the center of the sprawling circular driveway, gasping for breath, surrounded by the deafening roar of the diesel engines pulling his stolen luxury vehicles away. I did not offer him a second glance. I turned on my heel, signaling to Tavon, and we stepped back into the climate-controlled sanctuary of my SUV. As my driver pulled away from the estate, I watched through the tinted rear window. Jamal was scrambling to his feet, frantically looking around at the crowd of partygoers. The beautiful hangers-on were already dispersing, averting their eyes, whispering behind their plastic cups. His grand illusion had been violently shattered. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial the numbers. I knew exactly who he was calling. He was dialing the only person left on the planet who would validate his delusion. He was calling our mother. It took Jamal nearly 2 hours and a heavily surged rideshare to reach my parents' estate in Prince George's County. He burst through the heavy mahogany front doors, sobbing uncontrollably, completely, reverting to the emotional state of a terrified, helpless toddler. He threw himself onto the plush custom sofa in the formal living room, burying his tear-stained face in his hands, wailing about the repossession agents, the massive public humiliation, and the absolute permanent destruction of his social standing. Yvonne stood over her weeping son, her perfectly manicured hands trembling with a sudden violent surge of adrenaline. Dion had already returned from my corporate boardroom a completely shattered shell of a man. He had locked himself in the master bedroom with a heavy bottle of scotch staring blankly at the wall after signing his entire life, his company, and his assets away to me. But seeing Jamal broken, seeing her precious golden child weeping on her expensive furniture, triggered a terrifying seismic shift in my mother's psychology. The blanket of denial she had been wearing instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a dark, toxic, narcissistic rage. She finally understood the terrifying reality of the situation. I held every single card. I had seized the bank accounts. I owned the debt. I held the absolute, indisputable power of attorney. I had systematically dismantled her favorite child's fraudulent life with a few strokes of a pen. A rational parent would have recognized their catastrophic failure, sought immediate legal counsel, and begged for a quiet settlement. Yvonne was not a rational parent. In her twisted, deeply prejudiced mind, she was the ultimate victim of a vicious, ungrateful daughter. She refused to surrender. She marched into Dayon's home office, yanked open the heavy bottom drawer of his desk, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. They had prepared it weeks ago just in case their extortion scheme required heavier, more dangerous legal backing. She shoved the envelope into her hardware-studded designer handbag, grabbed her car keys, and stormed out of the house. My personal residence was located in an ultra-exclusive, heavily monitored gated community in McLean, Virginia. It was a pristine, silent fortress designed specifically to keep erratic, dangerous people like my mother far away. The perimeter was lined with high stone walls, and access required clearing a 24-hour armed security checkpoint. Yvonne knew she was not on my approved visitor list. She knew the guards would turn her away the second she stated her name. She did not care. She parked her heavy, luxury SUV just down the street from the main entrance, watching the traffic flow with manic, hyper-focused intensity. When a massive commercial delivery truck pulled up to the guardhouse and was cleared for entry, Yvonne slammed her foot on the accelerator. She aggressively tailgated the heavy truck, riding mere inches from its rear bumper, slipping through the heavy iron gates a fraction of a second before they could swing shut and lock her out. The security guards shouted and rushed out of the booth, their radios blaring, but she ignored them completely. She hit the gas, speeding dangerously down the pristine, tree-lined streets of my neighborhood. She drove erratically, taking sharp turns, cutting over manicured medians, and ignoring stop signs until she reached my property. My house was a stark, modern architectural masterpiece of glass, steel, and concrete, entirely surrounded by flawless landscaping and high-definition security cameras. Yvonne slammed her SUV into park right in the middle of my driveway, the heavy tires tearing up a massive patch of my immaculate front lawn. She threw her car door open and marched toward my front steps. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed red with uncontrolled, blinding fury. Her eyes darted around the property, catching the small, blinking red lights of the security cameras mounted under the sleek eaves of my porch. The sight of the surveillance equipment pushed her completely over the edge. She realized I was watching her. She realized I was documenting her insanity. Yvonne let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed across the quiet, affluent neighborhood. She grabbed her heavy designer handbag by the leather straps and swung it like a medieval weapon. The solid brass hardware of the purse smashed directly into the nearest security camera, shattering the glass lens and ripping the internal wiring straight from the stucco wall. She swung again, striking the sleek digital doorbell, cracking the casing, and leaving a deep, violent dent in the metal. Pieces of plastic and glass rained down onto the porch. She was panting, screaming my name, completely losing her grip on reality. I did not cower inside my foyer. I did not frantically dial the police. I calmly unlocked my heavy oak front door and stepped out onto the porch. I stood at the top of the stairs looking down at her. I wore a simple silk blouse and tailored trousers, holding a steaming mug of tea, completely unbothered by her violent display. Seeing my perfect, unshakable composure only fueled her psychotic breakdown. She stopped swinging her ruined handbag and pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at my face. "You were always jealous of him," Yvonne screamed, her voice carrying off the glass walls of my home, broadcasting her toxic bigotry to the entire street. "You were always jealous of his light skin and his potential. He is beautiful. He is special. And you are just a bitter, ugly girl who has to steal from her own family to feel powerful. You could never stand that he was the favorite. You could never stand that he deserved better than you." Her words were meant to destroy me. They were the exact same vicious colorist insults she had whispered in my ear when I was a child. The constant vile reminders that I was too dark, too plain, too insignificant to ever warrant her love. But standing there at 29 years old, a self-made corporate titan, surveying a woman throwing a violent temper tantrum on my lawn, her words held absolutely zero power. They were just the pathetic, racist ramblings of a failed mother. I did not yell back. I casually tapped a small button on the side of my smartwatch. The digital face chimed softly, instantly activating a high-definition audio application that recorded every single syllable of her unhinged, abusive tirade to my secure cloud server. She was actively handing me the psychological and legal ammunition I needed to bury her forever. Yvonne realized her childhood insults were not breaking my composure. She realized she needed a much bigger weapon to tear me down. She ripped open her damaged handbag and pulled out the crumpled manila envelope she had taken from Dion's desk. She marched up the first 2 steps of my porch and aggressively shoved a thick, heavily stamped legal document toward my face. "You think you won?" Yvonne hissed, her chest heaving, a terrifying, desperate smile stretching across her face. "You think you can steal our business and ruin your brother? Read it, Aaliyah. Read the signatures. Read the dates." I did not take the paper from her shaking hand. I simply glanced down at the bold print. It was a corporate partnership contract heavily backdated by 5 years, completely fabricated, and allegedly signed by both of my parents and myself. "This is a legally binding agreement," Yvonne screamed, her eyes wide and wild with delusional victory. "It proves that Apex Financial was seeded by family funds. It proves that Dion Logistics provided the initial $200,000 capital investment that launched your entire empire. You did not build anything on your own. We own you. I am taking this straight to a federal judge. I am going to sue you for total absolute ownership of Apex Financial. I will take your company. I will take this house, and I will leave you on the street where you belong." It was the ultimate act of narcissistic delusion. She had cornered herself, and her final move was a desperate, spectacularly illegal forgery designed to steal my entire corporate entity. She stood there breathing hard, waiting for me to panic. She waited for the little girl she used to torment to drop to her knees and beg for a compromise. She truly believed this fake piece of paper would force me to hand over the keys to my kingdom. I took a slow, calm sip of my tea. I looked at the blatantly forged document, then looked directly into my mother's wild, hateful eyes. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. "See you in court, Mother." The heavy thump of Judge Harrison's gavel echoed through the courtroom, sealing their immediate fate. The federal court officers moved in swiftly, clamping heavy steel handcuffs around my parents' wrists right there in front of the stunned gallery. The sheer, unadulterated humiliation of being marched out of a federal building in physical restraints was a blow Yvonne and Dion had never anticipated in their wildest, most arrogant dreams. It took them 3 agonizing days in a holding cell to secure a shady, high-interest bail bondsman willing to take on their massive flight risk. They managed to post bail, but the financial hemorrhage was absolute and irreversible. I had successfully petitioned the court to freeze every single one of their remaining corporate accounts. Their platinum credit lines were instantly revoked. Their hidden offshore assets were flagged by federal investigators. They were bleeding out financially, drowning in impending astronomical legal fees and the terrifying, unavoidable reality of federal prison. Yet their malignant narcissism overrode their basic survival instincts. They were desperate to maintain their pristine, wealthy social standing at all costs. Canceling their highly publicized, long-planned 30th anniversary gala at the Buckhead Country Club would be a public admission of defeat. Worse, Dion saw the extravagant gala as a final, desperate lifeline. He intended to use the lavish event to scam his wealthy church members and the Atlanta elite out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, disguising the theft as private expansion investments to secretly fund their criminal defense. The night of the gala arrived dripping in false opulence and profound desperation. The grand ballroom of the country club was packed to absolute capacity with local politicians, mega church pastors, and the upper crust of Atlanta society. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the sea of designer tuxedos and custom silk evening gowns. Dion and Yvonne worked the room, their faces plastered with tight, artificial smiles, pretending their empire was not actively burning to the ground. Yvonne laughed far too loudly at bad jokes, her eyes darting nervously toward the main entrance every few seconds. She wore her heaviest diamond necklace, blissfully ignoring the fact that it was slated for federal seizure. Dion gripped his scotch glass so tightly his knuckles turned white, sweating completely through his custom-tailored tuxedo shirt as he desperately pitched fictitious logistics contracts to anyone wealthy enough to listen. The pristine, carefully managed illusion began to crack the moment Chloe arrived. My older sister had spent her entire life playing the role of the dutiful, obedient daughter, willfully blind to their toxic manipulations. But seeing the forged documents and the undeniable bank statements had finally shattered her lifelong conditioning. She walked into the ballroom wearing a stunning emerald gown, her head held high. She was flanked closely by Tavon, whose massive, intimidating presence instantly parted the crowded room. Yvonne immediately spotted her eldest daughter and frantically waved her over to the prominent elevated head table reserved for the family, desperate to project an image of familial unity. Chloe did not even break her stride. She walked directly up to our mother, looking down at her with unmistakable ice-cold disgust. Yvonne reached out to grab her arm for a photo, but Chloe physically stepped back, refusing the touch. She loudly and clearly stated she would rather sit in the parking lot than share a meal with a pair of federal criminals. Chloe turned her back on her gasping mother and walked straight to the back of the room, taking a seat at a small table reserved for minor vendors. The public rejection was a physical blow. Whispers instantly erupted among the elite guests. The picture-perfect family narrative was rapidly disintegrating right in front of their eyes, and Yvonne had to grip the edge of the linen-covered table to keep her knees from buckling. While his parents desperately tried to keep the sinking ship afloat in the main ballroom, Jamal was spiraling into complete hyperventilating panic in the shadows of the club. His luxury vehicles were gone. His fraudulent credit cards were declining at local fast food restaurants. He owed terrifying amounts of cash to dangerous people who did not care about his fabricated trust fund. Pure desperation drove him to the club's secluded, dimly lit coat room. He knew his parents had set up an ornate, locked donation box at the entrance, allegedly collecting funds for a church youth initiative. Jamal slipped into the coat room, checking over his shoulder like a cornered rat. His hands were shaking violently as he knelt beside the heavy wooden box. He pulled a stolen silver letter opener from his pocket and began frantically jabbing it into the brass lock. He was sweating profusely, grunting as he tried to pry the heavy lid open to steal the thick envelopes of cash and checks intended for charity. He was so utterly consumed by his own pathetic desperation that he never heard the heavy, measured footsteps approaching from behind. A massive, immovable hand clamped down onto Jamal's shoulder with bone-crushing force. Jamal gasped and dropped the letter opener, spinning around to find Taven staring down at him. The sheer cold menace radiating from Taven was paralyzing. He did not say a single word. He did not ask for an explanation. He simply reached down, grabbed Jamal by the collar of his expensive velvet dinner jacket, and hauled him effortlessly to his feet. Jamal kicked and thrashed, whining in protest, begging Tavon to let him go, promising he was just trying to fix a minor misunderstanding. Tavon ignored his pathetic whimpering entirely, dragging the struggling fraud down the long carpeted hallway, directly toward the main event. Inside the ballroom, the string quartet faded into silence as the dinner service concluded. Dion climbed the carpeted steps to the main stage, adjusting his silk tie, his face slick with nervous sweat. He tapped the microphone twice, the sharp feedback echoing over the hushed, expectant crowd. He forced his trademark charismatic grin, preparing to launch into the predatory investment pitch that he believed would generate the cash to save him from federal prison. "Good evening, my esteemed friends, colleagues, and family." Dion began, his voice wavering slightly before catching its practiced booming rhythm. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of building an unshakable legacy in this beautiful city. We brought you all here tonight not just to celebrate our past, but to invite you into our incredibly lucrative future. Due to overwhelming demand, we are opening up a highly exclusive limited window for private investments in our latest corporate expansion. This is a chance for generational wealth. He never got to finish his fraudulent pitch. The side doors near the stage violently burst open, the wood slamming hard against the walls. Tavon stepped through the frame and hurled Jamal forward with terrifying physical force. Jamal stumbled wildly across the polished hardwood dance floor, the fabric of his velvet jacket ripping as he fell. He slid on his knees until he stopped dead center in front of the stage, gasping for air. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. Wealthy women clutched their pearls. Prominent businessmen stepped back in utter shock. Jamal scrambled to sit up, his face flushed with sheer terror and absolute humiliation, exposed as a sniveling coward in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress. Dion froze at the podium, the microphone slipping from his trembling hand. Yvonne let out a strangled, horrified gasp from the head table, knocking over her crystal wineglass. The deafening silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the realization that the Williams family empire was imploding in real time. Then the massive 10-foot-tall mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open. The heavy metal hinges groaned, drawing every single eye in the cavernous room to the back. I stepped over the threshold, moving with lethal, unhurried grace. I wore a breathtaking floor-length crimson gown that demanded absolute attention, the heavy silk fabric flowing behind me like spilled blood. My heels clicked sharply, methodically against the polished floor. I did not look at the shocked guests parting ways for me. I did not look at my pathetic brother groveling on the floor. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father, standing paralyzed on the stage. In my right hand, I held a thick black leather binder containing the absolute destruction of their entire existence. I did not break my stride. The heavy silence of the grand ballroom was shattered only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished mahogany floor. Every eye in the cavernous space turned to watch me move. The wealthy politicians, the prominent socialites, and the megachurch pastors parted like the Red Sea, creating a clear, unobstructed path directly to the main stage. Dion saw me approaching. The artificial, charismatic mask melted off his face, replaced by a pale, sickly sheen of absolute panic. He desperately tapped the microphone, trying to project his booming voice over the sudden agitated murmurs of the crowd. He intended to order security to remove me. He intended to shout me down. But the country club general manager, a man I had personally briefed and heavily compensated hours prior, stepped out of the shadows near the kitchen doors and gave me a curt, respectful nod. Dion opened his mouth to speak, but the sound system emitted a flat, dead pop. The microphone was entirely cut. The heavy, oppressive silence returned, amplifying the sound of my footsteps as I climbed the carpeted stairs to the stage. Dion took a frantic step backward, his hands raised defensively. I did not acknowledge him. I turned my attention to the audio-visual booth perched high in the rear balcony. I raised my left hand and gave a precise, prearranged signal. The massive digital screens flanking the stage, which had been displaying a romantic sepia-toned slideshow of my parents' 30-year marriage, flickered violently. The images of their fake, joyous past vanished. The screens instantly flooded with the harsh, blinding white light of high-definition, scanned legal documents. I had promised total destruction, and I delivered it on a massive, undeniable scale. The screens displayed the backdated forged corporate partnership contracts, complete with the fake signatures my parents had submitted to a federal judge. The images shifted, bringing up heavily redacted but clear banking statements, highlighting the systematic, rapid draining of their legitimate corporate accounts. The visual assault did not stop there. The screens flashed a massive, undeniable collage of active federal foreclosure notices stamped in bright red ink across their multi-million-dollar estate. To complete the exhibit, the AV team displayed Jamal's exorbitant six-figure VIP nightclub receipts, proving exactly where their stolen money had been squandered. The reaction from the ballroom was visceral. The gasps echoed like a physical shockwave. The elite of Atlanta did not just whisper. They pointed. They recoiled. Decades of a carefully curated, flawless social facade evaporated in less than 30 seconds. The guests stared at the screens, reading the undeniable proof of absolute financial ruin. I calmly walked to the podium and picked up the secondary hardwired microphone. I tested it with a single tap. The sound rang out with crystal clarity. "Good evening," I announced, my voice smooth, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. "My father was just about to ask you for your hard-earned capital. He was about to offer you the chance of a lifetime to invest in his corporate expansion. I highly advise against writing him a single check." Dion lunged forward, his face twisted in desperate rage, attempting to snatch the microphone from my hand. He never made it. Taven was already there. My head of security stepped onto the stage with terrifying speed and placed a massive, immovable hand firmly against my father's chest. Taven pinned Dion to his spot, neutralizing him instantly. I turned my focus back to the horrified audience. "The man standing before you is entirely bankrupt. The luxury car he drove here tonight, the custom suit he is wearing, and the very mansion he planned to sleep in are no longer his. They are currently owned in their entirety by my firm, Apex Financial. This total asset seizure is the direct result of severe systemic corporate fraud, rampant embezzlement, and a failed spectacular attempt to steal my company using forged federal documents." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Wealthy investors physically stepped back from the stage. The elite community watched in stunned fascination as the Williams family empire burned to ashes before their eyes. The realization of permanent social death finally broke Yvonne. The impending federal charges were terrifying, but being exposed as a fraud in front of her entire high society network destroyed her soul. She stumbled forward from the head table, rushing the stage. She did not yell in anger. She broke down completely. Yvonne fell to her knees right at the edge of the stage. Her expensive pale pink silk dress pooled around her on the hardwood floor. She grabbed the edge of the stage, looking up at me with wide, frantic eyes. "Please, Aaliyah!" Yvonne sobbed, real, hyperventilating tears, ruining her meticulous makeup, streaming down her face in dark mascara-stained streaks. "Please, we have absolutely nothing left. Do not do this to us. We are your parents." The entire room of high society elites watched in breathless, suffocating silence. The mighty, untouchable matriarch of the Williams family was openly groveling at the feet of the daughter she had spent 29 years abusing, neglecting, and discarding. The poetic justice of her public submission hung heavy in the air. I looked down at her. My expression remained entirely unreadable. I felt no joy in her tears. I felt no residual anger, and I felt absolutely no pity. It was simply the cold, hard administration of long overdue justice. I slowly unclasped the brass lock of my designer clutch. The sharp click echoed through the dead silent room. I reached inside the silk lining. I did not pull out a legal settlement. I did not pull out a corporate contract. I pulled out a single crisp $50 bill. I bent down slightly, looking directly into my mother's tear-stained, horrified eyes. I held the bill out over the edge of the stage. I opened my fingers and let the currency flutter down, landing perfectly on the polished floor, right in front of her trembling knees. "Here is $50, Mother," I stated, my voice carrying the exact dismissive cadence she had used against me at the airport 14 years ago. "Figure it out." Yvonne stared at the bill, the full, devastating weight of the memory crashing down on her. The room remained paralyzed. I stood back up, adjusting my posture perfectly. "Oh, and the country club management just informed me that the credit card you used to secure tonight's extravagant catering and open bar has officially bounced." Since you are no longer paying members, you are officially trespassing on private property. I turned my back on them. I did not look back. I walked down the center steps of the stage and strode back down the main aisle with absolute authority. Taven released his iron grip on Dion and fell into step directly behind my right shoulder. Chloe stood up from her small table at the back of the room. She held her head high, a look of profound liberation on her face, and proudly joined our procession toward the exit. Behind us, the country club security guards, flanked by local police officers the manager had placed on standby, moved in swiftly. The illusion was over. They grabbed the sobbing, hysterical Yvonne by her arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. They flanked a completely shell-shocked, catatonic Dion, dragging him away from the podium. They scooped up Jamal from the floor where he had been paralyzed by fear. The guards began forcefully escorting the entire Williams family toward the service exit at the back of the building. The wealthy guests offered zero sympathy. Loyalty in these circles was entirely conditional on wealth. They pulled out their smartphones, the camera flashes illuminating the massive, unprecedented social execution. They recorded every humiliating, pathetic second of the Williams family being physically thrown out of their own anniversary gala. I pushed open the heavy front doors of the country club, the cool, crisp night air hitting my face. The circular driveway was no longer a valet staging area. It was bathed in the harsh, flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers. The district attorney had not taken their blatant perjury and the submission of forged documents to a federal judge lightly. The trap had fully snapped shut. As club security shoved my parents and brother out the side doors into the harsh glare of the police spotlights, federal agents moved in immediately. They grabbed Dion, slamming him against the side of a cruiser, and violently snapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists, loudly reading him his rights for massive corporate fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Yvonne shrieked in terror as a female officer secured her wrists as well, arresting her as an active co-conspirator to federal crimes. They did not arrest Jamal. He had not signed the forged documents. He was too cowardly and legally insignificant to be included in the federal indictments. The police simply pushed him aside to clear the path. Jamal was left standing alone on the cold concrete curb, watching his parents being shoved into the back of police cars. His tailored velvet jacket was torn. His fraudulent empire was gone. He had no car, no credit cards, no trust fund, and absolutely nowhere to go. The golden child stood shivering in the night air, completely, permanently penniless and entirely alone. 6 months passed with the swift, unforgiving momentum of absolute justice. The spectacular collapse of the Williams family empire was not a temporary setback or a momentary lapse in public relations. It was a permanent, irrevocable extinction. Dion Williams, the former titan of Atlanta logistics and self-proclaimed patriarch of high society, currently resides in a federal correctional institution in Cumberland. The swift and brutal federal trial completely dismantled his arrogant facade. The judge showed zero leniency for his calculated perjury and attempted corporate theft. The smirk that once defined his existence has been completely erased, replaced by the hollow, sunken stare of an inmate serving a mandatory 3-year sentence for wire fraud and conspiracy. There are no corporate boardrooms in federal prison. There are no wealthy investors to charm or megachurch pastors to swindle. He spends his days wiping down cafeteria tables and his nights staring at the cinderblock walls of a damp 6x8 cell. The man who tried to steal my empire is now told exactly when to sleep, when to wake, and when to speak. His bespoke suits have been replaced by a scratchy standard-issue khaki jumpsuit, and his authority is completely non-existent. Yvonne's reality is arguably far worse because she has to live it in the civilian world, stripped entirely of the protective bubble of extreme wealth. Her sprawling estate in Prince George County was liquidated to pay off a fraction of their staggering legal debts. Her designer wardrobe, her imported jewelry, and her luxury vehicles were seized by federal authorities. Today, my mother resides in a cramped, aggressively depressing one-bedroom apartment in a decaying complex on the outskirts of the city. The pale pink silk gowns have been replaced by a stiff polyester polo shirt and sensible non-slip orthopedic shoes. She works the reception desk at a local rundown laundromat. The woman who once terrorized country club staff over the temperature of her Chardonnay now spends 9 hours a day making exact change for industrial washing machines and wiping up spilled sticky detergent from cracked linoleum floors. She operates in complete anonymity. Her high society friends abandoned her the exact second the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. When she tries to call them, the lines are disconnected. There are no more charity galas. There are only flickering fluorescent lights, the overwhelming stench of cheap bleach, and the crushing, inescapable weight of minimum wage survival. And then there is Jamal, the golden child, the brilliant, untouchable future surgeon whose entire identity was funded by fraudulent credit lines and stolen charity donations. Without his parents to shield him from the consequences of his own profound laziness, gravity took hold with brutal efficiency. He was completely cut off from all funds. The friends who gladly drank his bottle service abandoned him immediately. Today, Jamal wears a different kind of uniform. It is heavily stained with fry grease and smells perpetually of stale onions. He works the closing shift at a heavily trafficked fast food franchise on the highway. He spends his evenings plunging industrial fryers, wiping down sticky plastic tables, and hauling leaking heavy black trash bags out to the dumpsters in the freezing rain. The luxury vehicles he used to flaunt are a distant memory. He rides the city bus, staring out the scratched windows with blistered hands. He is finally learning the brutal, unfiltered value of hard work, and he is learning it the absolute hard way at the very bottom of the economic food chain. Far removed from their misery, I found my absolute peace. Sunday evening settled over Washington, D.C. with a crisp, clear beauty. Inside my multi-million-dollar penthouse, the atmosphere was entirely different from the toxic, suffocating dinners of my youth. There were no hidden agendas. There were no passive-aggressive insults or desperate attempts to secure funding. There was only genuine, unadulterated warmth. I stood in my expansive state-of-the-art chef's kitchen, pouring a bold, full-bodied Cabernet Sauvignon into crystal glasses. Chloe sat at the massive marble island, laughing loudly, her face completely radiant and free of the heavy, anxious tension she had carried her entire life. She had officially cut all ties with our parents, reclaiming her own identity, and launching her own successful consulting firm with zero guilt. Tavon stood next to her, casually tossing a salad, a rare relaxed smile breaking through his usual stoic military demeanor. He had transitioned from my head of security to a trusted, indispensable part of my inner circle. We shared a meal filled with authentic joy, celebrating Chloe's recent promotion and my firm's latest highly lucrative international acquisition. We were a real family forged not by blood and obligation, but by mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the shared survival of a toxic regime. After dinner, as Chloe and Tavon relaxed in the media room, watching a film, I walked quietly into my private home office. The space was immaculate, lined with sleek glass bookshelves and commanding views of the Capitol. I approached the far wall, where a single specific item was mounted under thick UV-protected museum glass in a heavy matte black frame. It was a crisp, perfect $50 bill. It was the exact denomination my mother had thrown at me in the airport terminal 14 years ago, the very catalyst that had ignited my absolute unstoppable rise to power. It served as a permanent, silent reminder of the cruelty that built my empire and the absolute necessity of financial independence. I traced the edge of the frame, feeling a profound sense of closure. The ledger was officially closed. Every debt had been repaid in full. I turned away from the frame and walked out onto my sweeping private balcony. The night air was cool and refreshing against my skin. The glittering skyline of Washington, D.C. stretched out before me, a vast glowing grid of power, influence, and endless opportunity. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive wine, feeling the rich, dark vintage warm my chest. I looked down at the city I had conquered, the life I had built from the ashes of their rejection, and the empire that was entirely undeniably mine. I was perfectly permanently at peace. The screen fades to black,